No. Okay. Hello, everybody. Let's just get started. And thanks a lot for joining us today for the session on exposing child abuse. We'll introduce 3 different projects to you and share some thoughts on how to work with vulnerable sources and track predators and access very closed environments. And with me up here, I've got Suzanne Smith from Crikey Inc., which is an independent Australian news publication. And Susan has been an investigative journalist for 25 years, I think. And she's also been the driving force behind one of Australia's and probably the world's biggest journalistic exposures of child abuse within the Catholic Church, which is what she'll tell us more about. And Martha Mendoza is an AP journalist and a 2-time Pulitzer winner. And this year her reporting on the abuse of detained migrant children made her a finalist again for the Pulitzer Prize, and she'll tell us some more about that work. And my name is Frauke Giebner. I'm a journalist at Politiken, which is Denmark's largest daily, and I'll talk about a project that I was involved in and where we uncovered that the making of some of the most iconic Danish youth movies was connected to systematic sexual abuse of child actors. And once we're done with our presentations, there'll be a little bit of time for questions from you. So, Martha.
Am I on? Yep. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. There's another Aussie over there who was actually part of this story, so I'll embarrass her later. So my story sort of has a happy ending. And I know that's weird when we're talking about child sexual abuse, but I'm going to tell you about how in Australia, journalists caused the biggest judicial investigation and inquiry in the world. And it was a team of journalists from competing media organisations that decided to join forces in a mission to get a royal commission. Now, for people from countries that haven't been colonised by the English, a royal commission is the biggest judicial inquiry you can get. It has subpoena powers. It's not thwarted by the rules of evidence in court cases. The criminal charges flow from it. Special police units are behind there, referring everything to prosecutions. It is the holy grail for investigative journalists. If you are investigating a closed community, and I am going to focus on the Catholic Church. Obviously, there were other religions that had terrible abuse of children, but our investigation was on the Catholic Church because it was the worst offender in Australia. Australia was a country that had a lot of Irish migrants and Polish migrants, and the MO of the Catholic Church in Australia was the same in America, it was the same in Ireland, it was the same in Poland, and it was all controlled by the Vatican. So I'm going to focus on the Catholic Church, but it wasn't the only church, of course. So the happy ending to this story is a group of journalists caused this major royal commission. And what that royal commission did, it went for 5 years, it cost $1 billion, 4,000 clergy were sent to police for prosecution. It removed impediments to suing the church because we had this law in Australia where you couldn't sue the Catholic Church if you were a survivor or a victim, because it wasn't a legal entity, because priests were employed by God. Just think about that. So all those poor survivors, it was called the Ellis defence, used to go to court in Australia, and the courts would throw out their claims because priests didn't have employers. So we had this archaic system where the Catholic Church, and it, as an institution, was able to have great power within the judiciary, within the police. And we had this terrible system which, as a group of journalists, we saw needed to be addressed. So it's our spotlight, really. It's exactly what happened in Boston, and it was very, very similar. So I want to say to you that I think this story is really how we're all going to have to operate now in this current landscape. And you can achieve great things if we put our egos away and we help each other and we share information and we share data, and if we get a document, we share it with like-minded people who want to be on the same mission as you. And it's especially important if you're against a formidable opponent, an institution like the Catholic Church, which has its own laws. It has canon laws. And they were breaching our civil laws. It was like a criminal organisation during this period. Thousands of children were sexually abused, and the rule of law did not apply. That's okay. Anyway, so how did this happen? How did a group of journalists who normally like to scoop each other, right? We all like to scoop each other. Well, when you've got a formidable opponent and a secret institution that operates like a secret community, and you can't get any information out of that community, you're never going to achieve what you want for your stories. So this idea that we all want to scoop each other and we've got egos and we want our names on bylines, that has to be thrown out for a start. So the first thing we did was there was about 5 or 6 journalists, and we decided we would join a mission. And it was a bit like strategizing for a war, okay? So there was me, I was on ABC television, which was like the BBC. There was the most brilliant journalist on the newspapers in a country area north of Sydney who had exposed so much of this egregious abuse. But she worked at a regional newspaper. Her name was Jo McCarthy. And I was at a national broadcaster with a massive audience and reach because I was on television. And I could see this regional journalist putting out story week after week in the local newspaper, and it wasn't getting the impact. Because the powerful leadership in the church and their connections thought, it's just a regional newspaper, right? It's just a reach over there. We don't have to worry about it. It's not reaching too many people. But what happens when I take those stories and I beam them nationally through the television? The impact, the audience, the reach, we're starting to help each other. So I started communicating with that regional journalist, and then there were other journalists in other states who were in competing media organisations, and we could tell they were all doing the same stories. It was all the same themes about cover-up, about criminality, about organised crime in the Catholic Church. And we decided to join a mission to get a royal commission. Because when you have hundreds of children, so that's a picture of Father Vince Ryan up there. Now, he was one of the biggest perpetrators up in Newcastle, in this area just north of Sydney. He had 39 boys, victims, from the age of 8 to 12. 3 times he told the Catholic Church he was a pedophile and could he get help, and they ignored him. It was staggering what he was allowed to get away with for 30 years. So this is what we were up against: deep criminality, a secret community which has its own laws and codes and languages. And if we went to the Catholic Church to ask about Father Vince Ryan, they told us to get lost. They didn't have to give us any documentation or anything. So this is where we decided to join a mission. The second thing that was really important in getting a national inquiry was to engage with survivors and victims and their families and teach them to be investigators. This was absolutely crucial. Because when you're dealing with a secret community, or closed communities I should say, like the Catholic Church, it's very hard to find out how those secret processes work. What does that actually look like? How do they treat victims? What are the processes when those victims go for compensation and all the agreements are confidential and journalists can't get those documents? But what we found was that hundreds of survivors and victims and their families had a lot of these documents because they'd had this interaction with the church in a secret way. And what we really had to do was engage those victims and families. And the third thing I want to talk about is, if you're dealing with closed communities, find the insiders, find the people that their moral compass is being, attacked. Find the people that are disgruntled inside these institutions, because there's a lot of Catholics that didn't like what was going on. There were a lot of principals, police, teachers, they were all there, and if you just look a bit harder, you can find them and they become your allies. So I'll just talk about journalists joining a mission. So if you're in a mission with your fellow journalists and you decide that you're going to support each other because your aim is to get a national inquiry, the first thing you do is share all your documents. And it really goes against us as journalists to do that. But you create a timeline of events and you share it with each other, because if you get one fact wrong, which I did once, they come after you. These institutions, they come after you if you get one fact wrong. So when you form a mission with these journalists, share everything. When one of the members of your team, which is how we saw each other, if the Catholic Church went after Joanne McCarthy, I would come in with a story on television. And I would say, look what they're saying about Joanne McCarthy, or this is what the truth is about that story. Like, follow each other, follow each other's stories. And if a member of your team gets a scoop, follow the scoop. You know, highlight it, give it promotion. We used to share things about defamation because the Catholic Church had the same lawyers, and they would send me letters and they'd send her letters and send the other journalists letters. So we'd compare, because sometimes my defamation lawyers didn't mind the risk so much as a smaller media company, and we'd share and we'd be able to put pressure on our legal teams, and you know, so we could help each other that way, because often investigative stories don't run because the lawyers say you can't run it. So we helped each other that way as well. And we shared contacts. So it's all the things journalists hate doing, like share your contacts, share your data, fact check. Fact check, I used to send my stories to Joanne and go, is this right? Is there any facts missing? And she was a competitor. So this was another way that we did that. On the issue of families and survivors, it's a very tricky thing, and I'm glad Kate McMahon's here because she was brilliant through this whole process for us. You need experts to help you if you're going to deal with survivor communities, because there's so much trauma and you don't want to cause any more harm for these people. But it's incredible how much information these families have about what went on behind closed doors. And there were some that were very willing to become investigators and super sleuths. And some of these people hadn't even gone to university. Some of these people had never done this before. But they'd ring me up and say, oh, I'm going to this library and I'm going to find the yearbook for this school and I'm going to find where the priest went next and then he went here, and you know, and that was really, really helpful. But it's a very sensitive relationship of trust. And you've got to be very careful how you use it, and you've got to be careful you only use the strong people in the survivor community. The other thing that the survivor community can do, which really helped us, was they formed their own group and they started to share information. So we found a very depressing picture. In this diocese, sort of 3 hours north of Sydney, it's a bit like Boston or Philadelphia or something like that. There were 3 Catholic schools operating in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and 60 men from those schools have suicided. And we were saying, how can this be? How can this be? And then through the survivor network up there, we were able to track that all these men had been victims of priests in 3 schools. And then through the survivor network, we found out that the principals of all those schools were paedophiles at the same time. And then we were able to find out that, you know, 7 or 8 teachers in each of these Catholic schools were paedophiles at the same time. Now, we could never have found that information if we hadn't enlisted the support and trust of the survivor network up there, who willingly, despite the trauma for their families, we actually created a register. And it's really important that you take those people with you. But as I said before, always seek expert advice from people who are experts in trauma, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without Kate McMahon here. She's doing some talks, aren't you, Kate? So if you ever want to talk to someone who's an expert, she's the woman. The other thing survivors have is emails and text messages, and you have to remember they're devout Catholics. Their families have been so embedded in the church for decades, and they keep all this stuff. They keep diaries, and they're your biggest asset. And you know what? A lot of them have really liked being involved because they feel like they've got a purpose. And if one of their loved ones has died or suicided, they feel they've got a purpose. And I've got incredible information from survivors that they just kept in an old file somewhere. You know, conversations they've had with priests, seeing priests with other priests in certain situations. It's so important. And the third thing is insiders. Just because you're investigating the Catholic Church doesn't mean there's lots of Catholics inside the church that also want change. And they're not actually too hard to find, because even priests and brothers are sexually abused in seminaries, and they want change as well. So look out for the lawyers, the priests, the teachers, on LinkedIn when people have left jobs suddenly, rumours. There are people inside who can help you. And now I got to become very close to the head of the child protection unit for this particular diocese. She was a woman and she was an atheist, and they'd employed her. She was a social worker. She's died now. Her name was Helen Cavers. And she got the job inside the diocese to fix the problem. And in the beginning it was going great. She was trying to sort of, you know, refer a lot of things to the police, but then the Council of Priests, which we found out later, half of them were paedophiles, turned on her, put a private investigator onto her and, you know, gave her the sack. So I met her after that, and she became my mentor, and she could translate, you know, the code, you know, how the Catholic Church got around state law. Time's up, okay. Anyway, all I want to say now is that if we act together and put our egos away and share information and look after each other, if you're prepared to do that and trust your fellow journalists, that is the best way to uncover and expose injustices, especially when it comes to child sexual abuse.
Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. So, hi everybody. Covering child abuse is the worst. We sat down and looked at each other, and you guys coming in to look at this today and learn more about this today is also saying that you're willing to put yourselves out there. It's a beat where sometimes I'll put my head down on the desk and cry. You know, I'll open a file, start to read. I see nods. Like, you just can't believe people would do this to children. You know, what I'm going to talk about today is realizing, kind of having the realization that our own country's immigration policy is abusive to kids, or became abusive to kids in recent years. Stop me while I'm talking. I know that's not really the GIJC way, but do stop me when I'm talking if I say something where you're like, wait, Martha, I didn't get what that was you were just saying. This is the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. And I take you to him because he was the first person known to try an experiment where he wanted to know what natural language was. So he had infants separated from their parents and had them nursed so they could eat and be bathed, but then just lie there. And he wanted to know how they would begin to speak and what would happen to them. Does anybody know what happened to these kids? They all died. Yeah, they died. This was the beginning of understanding from child trauma experts, I mean, over the years, that not only does separating kids from their parents and forcing them to be alone and often unheld and untouched creates not just a lifetime of damage, physical and emotional, it also creates generations, and this is something I'm sure you found as well, right? Because you're interviewing adults, but it's a lifetime and generations of trauma. So in the United States, we're separating kids from their parents and forced into slavery from the 1600s until it was abolished in 1865. And the legacy of this well-documented separations continues, and there's, established studies that there's been generations of trauma that continue to create problems in the United States. Around the time slavery was abolished, the United States government began kidnapping Native American children and forcing them to give up their language, cut their hair, take them from their parents, and put them in these schools. Any Canadians in here? So Canada has had an acknowledgement of this. The United States has not. Canada's going through a reconciliation period where they're trying to really understand what happened. In the United States, the legacy is poverty and addiction for generations of our Native Americans. So in April 2018, when the Trump administration began taking children, even babies, from their parents as they crossed the U.S. Mexico border, we were covering immigration, and we began rethinking, we're not covering immigration policy, we're covering child abuse. And there was no shortage of research and explanation and expertise to explain this. So we started, everybody was covering the spot news. Holy crap, they're taking these kids away from their parents? Like, what is that about? Is everyone familiar with this policy that began in the United States? Shake your head if you're not. Okay, we got it. Okay, so under the Trump administration, they decided that it would be a deterrent for people trying to seek asylum or immigrate to the United States if they took the kids away from the parents. And the parents would go to immigration detention for adults. And the children were turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services, which typically has run foster care programs, or actually they contract with Baptists, Lutherans, Methodists, Jews, Christians to run foster care programs. And so that's where these kids were going, but they, of course, didn't have nearly enough beds for all the kids, thousands of them that began arriving. And so we began talking to the experts. Dr. Alicia Lieberman runs the Early Trauma Treatment Network at University of California, San Francisco. And she said, children are biologically programmed to grow best in the care of a parent figure. When that bond is broken, through long and unexpected separations with no set timeline for reunion, children respond at the deepest psychological and emotional levels. Their fear triggers a flood of stress hormones that disrupt neural circuits in the brain. That emotional upset, again, means they're at a higher risk for heart attacks as they grow older. A Stanford University clinical psychologist whose work addresses the impact of early life stress said, children are being treated as cogs in a machine, and their individual background, interests, and unique identities are devalued as they are lost amongst the masses. This experience then becomes internalized with significant psychological consequences. This was as hundreds and thousands of kids were being taken. And I told Dr. Matlow, I said, you talk about this stuff like shrug, like of course everyone knows that, but I don't think that the American public was and is cognizant of what it does to a human being to yank them from their caregiver, from their mom and dad. And those of us who are adults and either have strong relationships with kids or have our own kids kind of get it, because the parents in these situations, by the way, they stop eating, they lose their hair, they become completely dysfunctional, the mothers or fathers who lose their kids. Some also commit suicide when they were taken to immigration detention after their kids were pulled from their arms. A Harvard University professor, and if any of you ever need these experts, I'm happy to share their contacts and they're happy to talk about it. He said he got pissed off when I called him and said, what does it do to the kids? Talk to me about the trauma. And he said, this is not a perplexing scientific puzzle, this is a moral disaster. And so these almost scoldings that we were getting from the experts prompted us to dig deep. And this meant trying to talk to parents and kids. And this means getting into the system of shelters, and there is some foster care, but there's also what we ended up calling detention camps, where they would put 2,000, 3,000 teenagers at a time. Dr. Matlow told me he went in one where they were sleeping 100 to a room, and these are teenagers, everybody was crying themselves to sleep. Like a room of 100 kids all crying. This father from El Salvador, whose 12-year-old son Omar was taken from him in June, said, it's a pain we will never get through. The kids are almost always told that their parents don't want them. The parents are told that they're bad people for trying to come into the United States. Omar spent 5 months away from his dad in a shelter, and when they were reunited, they gave Omar to his dad and a file of paperwork that showed that he had been hospitalized for depression. The day after we visited, he was re-hospitalized, and this is something we didn't talk a lot about, but covering child abuse, we try to protect the kids in many ways. They get to control their narrative, and I tell them that even when they're 4 years old, like, you can tell me whatever you want. They can quit talking. We don't show their faces, which drives our television partners crazy. But they're in shadow because as a child, or we'll show their hands, because as a child, they don't really have the capacity, perhaps, to be able to project what it's going to mean to have their image on the Associated Press wire service for the rest of their life. So you can see the caregivers at these places line them up in strollers. They walk them around in brigades. They're not allowed to hold and touch them. The U.S. government had some 50,000 children last year in shelters, detention camps, and foster programs. And when we go inside, these are not disgusting places often, although there have been some where there's been terrible abuses, and some of the caregivers have been imprisoned already for abuse, because some of these places are not doing any background screening because they have to staff up so quickly. But many are kind of clean, kind of nice, but what's happening to the kids is they don't know where their caregiver is. They don't know where the person who loves them is, and they're starting to shut down. Some get very hysterical and just cry and cry. There was a 10-year-old inconsolable girl who, she would wake up crying and then cry and cry, and then she would cry herself back to sleep, for weeks and weeks. There was one, so I mentioned that the parents are taken to immigration detention, the children are taken to Health and Human Services, but there's a period when both of them are together first. People come across the border and they either approach a Customs and Border Protection office, or if they sneak across like through a river, or they go through a point of entry and they say, I'm here to seek asylum, or I'm here to ask for immigration status. And when they do that, the first place they go is to Customs and Border Protection facility. This is like a local police department office, it would look like, with a couple cells to hold people and ask them questions. And it's in these places that the kids are taken from their parents. And the parents talk about sometimes trying to give them to some, like they don't want the kid traumatized. Other times they hold on to them as hard as they can. And in some of those places, the kids began to stack up also, because Health and Human Services said, we don't have enough beds. We're not taking them if we don't have a bed. I should mention that before this policy, the kids all they would stay with their parents, or if they came unaccompanied, they would be taken to their parents or whatever adult they were heading to see. And the kids in care range from infants to 17 years old. 2 weeks ago, we saw a 3-year-old kid. They were thinking that he was speaking Portuguese and that he might be from Brazil in this shelter, and they were looking on Facebook and talking to the consulate, trying to figure out who his parents were. Like, he had come with a parent. They had lost track of that connection. Then we began to learn about this woman, Araceli Ramos, was separated from her daughter Alexa and deported to El Salvador. The family who were the foster parents for Alexa fell in love with her, and who wouldn't, and decided that the girl would be better off with them. They went to state court and they petitioned for a termination of parental rights for the mother who was in El Salvador and has nothing and is not in touch with them. And the judge agreed that the girl would be better off with them and began the process of terminating parental rights. This family saw themselves as doing a wonderful thing for the little girl. Bethany Christian Foster Services backed them, but eventually Araceli got her daughter back, and we visited her in San Miguel, El Salvador, and they're not okay. Like, they can't, the mother cannot let the girl more than 3 feet away from her ever, and they need more support to get past this, I would say. But that was just a piece of it. This is a soccer ball outside of Tornillo detention camp in Texas, where they had about 3,000 kids, and increasingly, because protesters would show up, they put up more and more fencing. So these are kids also at Tornillo before they put up the fencing. They would walk them in straight lines. Some of the kids are incredibly resilient and come out of this and get back with their family and go to school and are kind of okay, and others are not. This was a 3-year-old who was being put into the foster system, and even when they're in professional care, often the young children, they fail to thrive. One child was 3 when the immigration officials took her from her father, and there's great documentation now because people are beginning to sue, but the foster care parent said she was having difficult eating, drinking, and using the toilet, and her father was deported to Honduras this summer, and it took about 6 months before they deported her back as well. This is the one of the larger shelters where they sleep in these tents. This place hired their staff without, they waived background checks and fingerprinting, and the way they get away with that is they build these on federal property. So they don't have to follow state laws, and it's our state laws that require fingerprinting and backgrounding. And yes, as I mentioned, there had been some arrests and convictions for abuse. It takes a very complicated process to sue the U.S. government, but this summer, their claims are starting to come in. Dozens of families separated at the border. What's happening in the United States is some really big law firms are partnering with some nonprofit child advocacy groups, identifying families that would be, that were very much harmed. Families like one where the dad commits suicide in a jail after his kid was taken from him, or kids who were put into the foster system and abused by other foster kids. And they're now preparing to sue the federal government. You have to file a claim, let that run for 6 months. If the US government does not respond, then you can sue for big money, like they're asking $2-3 million per family. These are, the reason this is effective is in the United States, that's how you push the needle. That's how you change policy, is by costing huge amounts of lawsuits, or it can be a way to change policy. So members of the Trump administration have said these separations will act as a deterrent to people trying to seek refuge or asylum, and just because we always need to, for sure, let everybody respond, I want you to know that the agency responsible for the migrant children says we treat the children in our care with dignity and respect. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think everything's fine. Thanks. Okay, so I was part of a team of 5 journalists who spent about 2 years on researching the systematic abuse of children and teenagers in the Danish film industry in the 1970s. And it turned out that 2 of the directors behind some of the most iconic Danish youth movies mainly had made those movies so they could get access to children. And today they both live in Thailand, the directors, and one of them still makes movies. This project was a joint venture between the newspaper where I work at and a broadcaster and a TV production company. And our story was the story of 22 child actors, 16 men, 16 women, and 6 men. But we spoke to a total of more than 100 people, and many of those who had been part of those movies, and many of those secondary sources were used in order to try to verify the information given by our main sources. So I'll tell you a bit about how we worked with the sources, who were, some of them at least, vulnerable and traumatized. And I'll also talk a bit about how we tracked down the abusers who had gone into hiding and did not want to be found. Oh, that was a bit quick. So everything was about building trust, and several of the people we spoke to had never talked about what had happened to them to anyone else before we called them and asked them about this thing that had happened 40 years ago. And all of us journalists, none of us had been born in the 70s. So it was a really big decision for them to trust us with their story. And we did a few things that I think helped in the process, and I'll just walk you through them quickly. One thing was we granted them access to their stories, to the entire story, to everything we wrote, everything like in the documentaries, which is not something we usually do. I think it's really different how you look upon this, depending on what country you're in or what the policy of your media outlet is, but it's unusual for us. We let them read everything. We discussed a lot of details and gave them, to some degree, the power to decide if there was something that we wanted to put in the story that they felt bad about, because it was important for us that they felt that they could take some of the power they had been stripped of as children, that they could take that back by telling their story. And we also shared information about the investigation with them while it was ongoing, because a lot of them thought they had been the only ones. We had 2 childhood friends who met again because of this project, and they had no idea that they were abused by the same man at the same time. So we kept them updated on how many people had we talked to and what had happened to the guy that abused them, where was he now? And letting sources meet. We didn't do that initially, but after we were done with the main research and we had recorded all the important interviews, some of the sources had a great wish to meet each other, and we let them get in touch. We provided contact information, and that really made them feel part of something bigger, part of a joint project. We also benefited from talking to the families, so we tried to make sure to get their partners or someone they were close to on our team, and that was helpful for us because some of our sources, one guy disappeared at some point. Once we were done with the interview, we couldn't get in touch with him again. We were really concerned about whether he was okay, and it was helpful to be able to talk to someone who knew him. Others had a hard time because this was very strenuous for them, and in some situations we asked them to do things they did not feel like doing, and then it was helpful to be able to explain to their partner why we think this is important, and then their partner could try to explain it to them as well, because often, in some situations it was easier to make the partner understand why it was important. Then time was a huge factor. I think one of our main sources spent 6 months considering whether she wanted to be part of this or not, and then once she decided she wanted to, she was all in, and she was a huge force. And what made her come around was talking to some of the others. And Carl, who's up there looking skeptically, he told us that if we had contacted him just 6 months earlier, he would not have talked to us at all, because back then he was still in therapy and he was not ready to speak about what had happened to him. So that made us think that we would return to some of the people who we had been in touch with and who said they did not want to be part of this project. And we decided to, after 4 months or 6 months, to send them a letter, a physical letter saying, so this is how it's going with the investigation, we're planning to publish then and then, and if you want any more information, just give us a call. If you should ever change your mind, you've got our number, we'll still be happy to talk to you. We also hired a psychologist, an independent psychologist, and asked all our main sources to talk to her twice. At least once before they made their final decision to be part of the project, and once before we published it. And there was a nice safety measure for us as well as for them. And for instance, we had this one guy who was mentally unstable, and he had been going back and forth on whether he wanted to go public or be anonymous. And then he had decided to be public. But after talking to the psychologist, we figured that it would be best for him to be anonymous. So she was helpful for us in making that decision. And we ended up building a really solid relation with our sources, which was nice. This is from a Happy Day where we were finalists for an award. And they really felt this was their work and this was their project, or it was our mutual project. But it was important to them as well, and it was really nice. So our relation with these two guys was not as good. Those are the directors. And they had both left Denmark, that much we knew, and we pretty early in the process found out that Ernst, the guy on the left, had left for Thailand, where he was running some sketchy travel agency. And then we hired a fixer and asked her to go to that city and find Ernst. And that was difficult for her. The travel agency was closed, nobody knew where he was, and she gave up after a couple of days. So we were on our own and decided we'd take a walk around that city on Google Maps. And we hadn't really any idea about what to look for, but we had found this one picture on Ernst's wife's Facebook account, which is a bunch of chairs. They got new chairs, and in the background you can see their gate. So my colleague went around this city looking for this gate, and he spent an entire day on that, and after 8 hours he was really bored and wanted to go home, and decided to just go down one more road, and it looked like this. And then finally, after a day of doing this, he found the gate. And from then on, it was easy to approach Ernst. The other guy, Lasse, was harder to find. He had told us, we had been in touch with him, he didn't want to do an interview. He had told us he was in France. We didn't really believe that. And some sources pointed towards him being in Thailand. And we then IP tracked him. If you have someone's, we had talked to him on Skype. And if you have someone's email address that they use for the Skype account, you can put that into a Skype grabber. There's several of those tools online. And if you do that while that person is online on Skype, it will give you an IP address. So we did that a couple of times every day for 3 weeks straight. And sometimes we could see that Lasse was using a VPN. That's what you see up there. And then his IP would ping in Australia or in Alberta in Canada. But most of the time, he seemed to be in Thailand. So we thought that's what we're going to believe in. Oh yeah, just a little practical thing. So once you've got the IP address, you have to put it into a geolocator. I find Whois, like the several Whois services, I find those to be the best, and it will give you the coordinates. So we got coordinates for Bangkok and for Pattaya and for some third smaller village in Thailand. And we hired another fixer, and she looked through his Facebook pictures and found some hints that made us believe that he'd most likely be somewhere around Pattaya, so we decided to go there. Before we did that, we tried some other things as well, like Grabify, and tried to make him send us a picture so we could extract the EXIF data and see where the picture was taken, so where he was. That didn't work. We went to Pattaya, and with us we had a last resort solution. Our plan A was to talk to the authorities. By that time we had hired a third fixer, and she had some really good sources within the authorities, but he wasn't registered anyway. So even though they were helpful, we didn't get anywhere. Then we talked to a Danish expert who was very central in Danish expert milieu, but nobody knew this guy, Lasse. And we were running out of time, and we were considering this last resort thing. So I'll try to explain it. It's a bit technical, but you need to know two things about Lasse, which is what we knew as well. The one is he's strongly dyslexic. The other thing is he's very fond of looking at his own work, and he's happy when people notice his work. So online, there are a lot of communities of men who are interested in young boys who share pictures like this on Tumblr and on YouTube, and a lot of Lasses content from the 70s was on those pages, and he always got very happy when someone pointed him towards it. So we found this one site which was like a Russian copy of YouTube. It was called YouTube, and it contained all of Lasse's videos that were available on his YouTube account. So we copied this content, and we copied it to a different domain, which was very similar to YouTube, but as you can see, the O and the U has switched places. We figured he'd never notice because he's dyslexic. And then once you access this site, there's this pop-up window on in the left corner that's asking you whether you want to disclose your location. You can say yes and you can say no. So we were hoping that he would access this on his mobile phone, where this tiny little box is way bigger, and then that he would say yes. And if he did so, his exact location would be sent to us. And we had planned to ask one of our colleagues who has a generic name to just send that link to Lasse and say, hey, check out your stuff, it's nice. Click on the link. We were very hesitant to do so because you can discuss whether it's an okay move or not. And also, I need to say all of this is prior to GDPR. So if you're in Europe and if you're considering trying anything of this or similar to this, make sure to check what you're allowed to do. But actually, before we sent this, we tried one last thing, and that was contacting Lasse's, internet provider, because when you IP track someone, you also get the internet provider. We didn't think that they would talk to us, but they gave us his address. We were very happy. Turned out it was the wrong address. Called them again, got another address, and then we finally found him and tried to talk to him. And yeah, I think one last comment, very similar to what Susan says, is I think it's really important to collaborate on those stories. We got together because we found out that Politiken and the other guys were working on the same story. In the beginning, we freaked out. We thought, oh my God, they're taking our story. But then we started working together, and it was really fruitful. And the story had a much bigger impact because it was published on several platforms at the same time and reached a much wider audience. Yeah, I think that was it. Now we've got a little bit of time for questions from you, if you have any. Yes, go ahead. Does he need a mic? I think this should work.
Thanks so much. General question for all three of you. Can you talk a little bit about, like, when you're dealing with topics like these, that with sort of like any normal person with a moral compass would be outraged, some of these issues you faced. How do you sort of make sure you don't become an advocate, that you keep a certain sense of distance and objectivity, however you want to define it, and you sort of remain a journalist and not some full-on advocate for something?
Testing. So that was the paradigm shift we had. Right? Oh, immigration policy, we're normalizing this. Yes, now they're going to deter them from coming by taking them away from their parents. You go to the experts, and the experts are like, now you're creating a lifetime of trauma. There is a right and wrong. And so it's kind of like, you are all too young to remember, but at some point with climate change, we stopped saying, like, there's two sides to this. that it's happening, right? And so it's not that we are advocating and writing opinion pieces, but we are exposing it as child abuse. And I would ask people in this room to, first of all, there's more children in detention in the United States than the rest of the world combined. But take a look at your own countries and what's normalized in care for children, and reflect on whether it's actually keeping them safe or not. Like the orphanages out of Romania, which were later found to be abusive to kids and causing a lifetime of trauma because the kids were not being held or cared for.
It's a good question. So when I was doing all these stories, I said to myself, if the behaviour of the institution is tantamount to organised crime, which side am I going to be on? And are there sides when it comes to hundreds of vulnerable children are being sexually abused, and those priests and brothers are breaking the law. So my answer to that is it's not bad to be an advocate if you're giving those vulnerable people a voice. When you have such egregious, such widespread criminality and deep criminality. So I think you're right. You make a choice at some point.
Yeah, I agree as well. And those people that we talked to, they had not been believed before. When they were kids, the grown-ups that they talked to the police, their parents, they didn't believe them. So I think it was their right to be heard. And of course, we tried to be fair, and we were interested in hearing from their abusers as well. The one guy we actually got to talk to thoroughly, the other one declined. But we were interested in getting their explanations and getting to know why they thought or why they did what they did.
Question of understanding, because you didn't say that explicitly, but did I understand you right that these two guys were producing child porn movies in Denmark in the 70s?
No, they were producing youth movies. So
Okay.
they kind of set the tone for the way we make entertainment for children in Denmark today. That comes from the 70s, and they invented it.
Okay.
For Politiken, for you as well. How did it all start? Did you start to dig the story, or some source approached you? Or?
It started in two ways. So initially it started with a completely different story. I had done a story on back in the time when child porn was legal in Denmark. We were first country to legalize porn, and we also legalized child porn, and then we exported it to the entire world. And I had talked to a police officer in the U.S., actually the one who tried to go after Michael Jackson the first time someone tried that. And he had given me some documents, because he at some point in the 70s had been in Denmark on an investigation trip. And on those documents there were some sources, and we found out that there was this abuse going on in the entertainment industry. Not this, something different, which was much bigger, but which we for some reason after a year of work had to discard. But while we were doing this, we found out about the things that were going on in the movie industry. And at the same time, one of the sources, Carl, who was looking skeptically up there earlier, he had seen what the director who abused him was doing online. And he had found out that the director had made a new movie in 2010 or 11, I think, with a kid that looked just like Carl when he was young. And he had become really concerned. And then he called my colleague and told her about it. Actually, his wife called my colleague and told her about it, and they started talking about this. So, different directions.
Question: did anything follow in your countries? Like, we have a commission here in Germany. It's called for sexual child abuse. And it's a commission. They followed first the churches, and then they followed the DDR children homes, and now they follow sports, the sports area. And I think it's interesting because they have a expert board, but the experts are also abused people, abused in youth time. So they have a big mixture of therapists and experts from the law side. And do you have anything followed in your country? Because I think it's a good idea.
I think it sounds great. We don't. How about you?
Well, since the Royal Commission, we've had massive reform through every state and territory changed its laws. We got uniform laws. We got a child commissioner. Hundreds more police, specialist child protection units. It was huge. It was fantastic. And it was great for the journalists involved because it made us want to continue reporting, because you get to a point where you think, I can't do another story on this. But then when you see that you get an outcome like that, it gives you hope, you know.
So they also have kind of hotlines there, like
oh, it's incredible what's there compared to what was there before and how appalling the system was.
Bunch of questions over there. I'll repeat the question. Okay.
The question to Suzanne, you talked about diaries and calendars and the things you got from the families. How did you find the other side proof? Because this is all telling about themselves. What other evidence was there when you started digging?
So I ran out of time a little bit, so I'm a firm believer in timelines and having, because you can come up with a hypothesis and it can be wrong. So you get your timeline and you get your victims and your survivors to help you with their information from their diaries. But what I didn't have time to tell you was a lot of those survivors have been through court trials and they've testified in courts, and those court documents, what you can find in a court trial, you've got the victim impact statements, you've got the police brief of evidence, you've got judges' statements, and what I used to do was cross-check everything the survivors told me from their own information with what's in the courts, because that way you won't be sued for defamation. Look, I've been reporting on this for 10 years. It just takes a long time, and the problem is that they're formidable opponents with lots of money, so you don't want to get one fact wrong, you know.
The church also keeps meticulous records, and so sometimes those come out in court,
Yeah.
and you have detailed letters from when they first entered the seminary and their psych exams, and, I think Father so-and-so should be transferred because, this family's upset with him, and so those are really helpful.
And also the reports of priests being sent to therapy,
Right.
particularly in the United States, by
Yeah.
the way, lots of therapy centres.
So I think we're out of time. If you still have questions, just come up and ask us. And there's a bunch of people waiting outside to get in. Thank you so much for coming.